So we've been talking a lot about how species evolve. So what is a species anyways? We're going to spend some time in this lesson talking about speciation and how we actually have different species evolve. So take a moment, look at the learning goals, and press play when you're ready to continue. This is what we're going to be focusing on for this lesson. So what is a species? Well, it's not quite that easy to figure out exactly what a species is. And there's a couple of different ways that we could approach it. We're going to look at 3 different ways today, focusing on the evolutionary one. So if you're writing anything down, make sure you copy that down. So one of the ways that we can start thinking about species is something called morphology. This is talking about the way that species look. And we could consider a species as 2 different organisms that look really similar to each other. So, we used to think that the oak titmouse and the juniper titmouse were actually the same bird. And it's not until we were able to actually develop DNA testing that we could tell that they're actually 2 different species. So morphology, it's an easy way to figure out species, but it's not necessarily the most accurate. Another way we could look at them is thinking about biological species. And we talk about species that are biologically different in the sense that they can actually interbreed, they can mate with each other and produce offspring that are capable of reproducing as well. A lot of times when you have different species mate, they'll produce offspring that are actually infertile. You might have heard of a liger, so a cross between a tiger and a lion. A lot of their offspring are unable to actually have children, so they can't continue that line of species, which means that they couldn't be a species. We also have 2 species here that are shown where we have different birds, and generally they appear to be identical, but because of certain patterns in their behavior, they never actually meet up to be able to mate. So even though they may be similar, the fact that they never actually reproduce together would separate them from a species definition. We're going to take a look at this from an evolutionary standpoint. And now we're looking at, what organisms actually reproduce together. So they may be isolated from each other, and that isolation creates difference. We'll take a look at this little picture here. We've got a lot of different lizards that are shown in a larger country, but because they all occupy different areas in that country and they don't interbreed with each other, they don't mate with each other, they're actually become different species due to that environment. So since there's no gene flow, since there's no reproduction, it starts to set organisms into different species. So let's just make sure that we have an understanding that having an idea of species can be really messy. There's always some kind of exceptions. If we talk about species as things that reproduce together, we'd be leaving out bacteria, because bacteria is actually asexual, meaning they don't reproduce with anything else. They can just kind of do it all themselves. So in this situation, that term of species as interbreeding populations wouldn't work very well. And then we also have examples such as the carrion crow and the hooded crow. They can actually have a hybrid, and that hybrid can be fertile, and that offspring can go and have other children as well. So does that make them the same species or different species? So a lot of confusions around this topic. For us, we're going to stick with that evolutionary definition just to try and clarify things up a little bit. So when we're talking about speciation, we're talking about that process by which we actually have new species arise. And going back to what we've said throughout this entire unit, it starts off with a common ancestor. And there are obviously things in the environment that causes certain organisms to change and adapt to those pressures, those environmental selective pressures. And other ones don't necessarily adapt in the same way. And because we have this differential adaptation, we might actually have some changes in genes. Let's go through a little example. So we're going to have a bunch of fruit flies that are hanging out on some rotten bananas. They lay their eggs on the bananas. So here's where we get our offspring being produced. However, in typical bottlenecks fashion, we have disaster strikes. A hurricane comes and it sweeps the bananas to another island that's further away from the original population. The eggs hatch. And now we have this big distance in between them. Those fruit flies would no longer be able to mate with those ones from the original population, simply because there's just so much distance in between them. Over time, because of that separation, different genes are going to be selected for. The island population might have different traits that are desirable there versus the one that would be on the mainland. And so since there's no gene flow in between these two populations, and we might have different selective pressures on them, then we start to shape, their morphology, their appearance, we start to change behaviors, and we start to change even their DNA over time. Now, down the line, perhaps there's another hurricane, and that hurricane comes and sweeps them back to the mainland. Those new flies that have evolved on the island are brought back to the original population. However, because they are now completely separate species, they won't actually mate. They might have different behaviors, different ways of communicating with each other around reproduction. And so you actually have no interbreeding occur. Let's take a look at a couple of different ways that we can look at speciation. So the last one we talk about is probably one of the easiest ones to understand, and it's simply when we have different organisms being separated. Because there's this big gap in between them, then there's no way to actually have gene flow, and each of them develops into their own species. Usually this is represented by physical barriers like mountain ranges or oceans, seas, different changes in the geographic environment, or something that has moved them to an area that's geographically remote from the original. We also have times where we can have speciation occur, even if they're in a fairly similar area, and we call this sympatric speciation. And that's when it's within the same geographic area, but gene flow gets reduced. So maybe we have different areas within that environment that things start occupying. If you have beetles that are able to, like they live on a tree, and then some are able to actually go a little bit further to the riverbanks by the tree, and they find lots of food there, they might start inhabiting that area. They might start to change their diet, so they're not in competition with those beetles on the tree. And if that goes on for long enough, well, then they'll become two different species with different ways of communicating, and they will not be able to reproduce anymore. So we see this happen with an example of apple maggot flies. We've got some flies that used to lay their eggs in hawthorn trees and other in apple trees. And there's a strong preference for flies to be able to lay their eggs in the same kind of tree that they grew up in. Maybe the flies were just feeling a little nostalgic for home. But because of that, even though you might have these trees right next to each other, you don't ever actually have the maggot flies going from one tree to another to breed with another population. And keep in mind, no gene flow, that's when speciation. The third type of speciation that occurs is parapatric speciation. So no barrier exists whatsoever. It just happens to describe the fact that we tend to connect with people who are a lot geographically closer. Think about this as in people in Brampton might be more likely to date each other than someone in Brampton and someone in Mississauga, even though they're still fairly accessible to each other. So if we have this range in which this organism exists, it's going to be kind of lazy and go for the other organisms that are pretty close to them, their neighbors, rather than organisms that might be a few trees down. So because it's not random, because they're picking things that are physically close to them, then we start to lead to some changes in the genes in the population. One special way that species can form is through something called adaptive radiation. Now, think about radiation as any time you have something starting from one point and it spreads outwards in all directions. Darwin saw this when he was looking at those finches in the Galapagos. Remember we talked about the different beaks and so on, but that all the finches were really closely related. Well, we had those original finches, and since they started to spread to other islands around that original population, they all started to change really quickly because of the varying environments that we found there, and also because they had different food sources. So while birds may have started out eating seeds, the ones that went to an area where there were a lot of trees available, and maybe not so many seeds, started to change their beak to eat leaves. Those that were in an area where there was a lot of insects that were in the trees started to sharpen their beak so that they could get at the insects there, and so on. So we started with one type of organism, and this was this rapid change, a big number of species that really quickly developed and gave us all of this variety that we saw in this finch population that helped Darwin come up with his idea of evolution. This is a really key thing for biodiversity because with most types of speciation, we're talking about over a long period of time. But adaptive happens fairly quickly, and where these other organisms go to close surrounding areas and very quickly adapt to their environments to suit their resource needs. Take a moment, look over those key questions to see how well you understood the lesson for today, and we'll follow this up more tomorrow.